And we are live. This Hangout on Air is live. I'm Brooke Lester. This is the Hangout of the week for OOTLE15, the Open Old Testament Learning Event 2015. And you can see our course page at OOTLE15.net, OOTLE15.net. And with me today is Sarah Koenig. Sarah, I have it written down, but why don't you go ahead and remind us your title and where you are.
Thanks. I'm Sarah Koenig. I'm the Associate Professor of Biblical Studies at Seattle Pacific University, which is obviously in Seattle.
Okay. And folks, some of my students will be following along, and you're welcome to follow along also at on Twitter at hashtag OOTLE15. What we're looking at today is where we are in the course. We're into the Pentateuch, not a moment too soon, I'm sure, as far as a lot of students are concerned. We've been into the Pentateuch. Last week was the primeval story, Genesis 1 through 11, creation, genealogies, flood, Tower of Babel, and so on. And this week gets us into what are usually called the ancestral narratives, or sometimes the patriarchal narratives, and that's Genesis 12 through 50. So that's the stories about Abraham, stories about Isaac, stories about Jacob, stories about Sarah, Rachel, Rebecca, Leah, you know, the whole crew. And also in at least the students who are taking the course now have been encouraged through lecture to reflect on covenant in the Hebrew Bible. So this was our chance to take the models of covenant that you have with the ancestors. God making a covenant with Abraham, for example, renewing that covenant with Abraham, renewing that covenant with Isaac, Jacob, and so on. What models of covenant are understood there, right? Ancient Near Eastern models of covenant that are understood there, and comparing them with, you know, the distinguishable, the noticeably different, but related concepts of covenant that you see in, for example, the Sinai pericope of Exodus 19 through 26, maybe more broadly in the Pentateuch as a whole, Deuteronomy kind of gets picked up in Joshua. And so people who have taken classes in the Hebrew Bible before, or other instructors, will recognize terms like suzerainty covenant between suzerains and vassals, as well as help me, what's the word for parity covenants between equal partners, right? And so aside from going through the ancestors and the ancestral narratives, there's also this reflection on covenant going on. And finally, just because of where we are in time, right? It's the end of April. It's the very end of April 2015, and the Baltimore protests are going on right now regarding the case of Freddie Gray. And I had asked learners a couple of weeks ago to participate in an activity around Ferguson syllabus, right? This ongoing effort on the part of instructors, both in K through 12 and higher ed, to better integrate, right? To find ways to integrate whatever our usual subject matter is, right? Here, Introduction to Hebrew Bible or Old Testament, and issues around Black Lives Matter, around state violence against people of color, and the social protests that have especially been going on around that in the United States during the 2014-2015 academic year. So that's a lot to sort of be going on in a single hour of a Google Hangout, and I don't know how much of it will hit. We're also at kind of an interesting time of the year because because of the way our course is put together. Some of my students will have finished their contracts for the year, and we may have a relatively small crowd joining us among our students on Twitter. So far, Will Meacham, I think you're the only one I see from our course right now. We'll see if there are other current OOTLE15 students that are following us at on the Twitter hashtag right now, go ahead and speak up and make yourselves known so that we sort of know who's out there. And if you would sort of help us along by gesturing towards what you would like us to cover of the ancestral narratives, Sarah and I can undoubtedly just start picking and choosing issues around Genesis 12 through 50 that interest us both in our research and our teaching, things that may be vexing, certain perennial hits like the binding of Isaac, right, the near sacrifice of Isaac in Genesis 22, Abraham passing his wife off as his sister twice, such that she's folded into the harem of a king. Yeah, everyone has sort of their greatest hits of Genesis 12 through 50. So maybe me and Sarah will get going on that while any of the students that are with us begin to have a chance to sort of make their presence known on Twitter and start steering things where they would like it to go. I don't know, Sarah, what do you think?
Well, hearing that intro, there is so much to talk about. So it's kind of fun to hear that. I'm going to jump on though to one of the things you said. One of the maybe less serious things, especially in light of what's happening in our country in Baltimore and what has been happening for years. But I love the fact that you refer to them as the ancestral narratives and not just the patriarchal narratives, because the women play such an interesting role in these texts. And I had I'm teaching undergrad students, so sophomores right now, an intro to the Bible class. And one of them made a comment in class yesterday that struck me as so interesting. She said she loved the Proverbs 31 woman, which is a whole other topic that we don't have to get into. But the reason why she said that is she said, because up until now, the women seem so deceitful. And the way that they make things happen, they're making stuff happen, but they do it by lying and manipulating. And so in this class, I didn't have a whole lot of time to respond to that comment by her. But I found myself thinking that, yeah, the women in Genesis, number one, I think they tend to get overlooked because they do play such an interesting role in moving the plot forward. You mentioned Brooke, Sarah, and Rebecca, and Hagar is another really important one for me in these texts. And somehow I think they got some interesting stuff in terms of who has the power in these situations, because specifically with Abram and Sarai, where she is in Genesis 16, she is the one really running the show, and Abram is just doing exactly what she tells him to do. And then Hagar comes in as well. So the main characters in that section are not, I would say, Abraham, but Sarai and Hagar, and then God and the angel of the Lord. So I love the fact that you're mentioning that, yeah, the women are important here. But have you ever gotten that pushback or that observation from students that the women seem deceitful in some way?
It was funny because I had a moment when this week, and somebody's going to have to remind me who this author is, because this is a book series that I actually knew nothing about. And I saw a reference to a title series. I think it was The Bad Girls of the Bible. And I sort of assumed when I saw the title that this was, some academic work that would be written by, somebody that I know who they are. And it would, and to your point, that it would take some kind of positive view of the quote unquote bad girls of the Bible. And of course, I think this because I take a really positive view of the bad girls of the Bible. But then when I investigated it, did you just look up the title?
I just looked up, it's the author by Liz Curtis Higgs, but there's a ton of them. I mean, there's multiple books.
Sorry, are they all by the same author, or are they different authors in a series?
I think it's the same author, although I remember reading one that was variations on that theme. I think it's one of those titles that people pick up on as sort of a catchy title because it's provocative. And I remember reading something about Bathsheba and Tamar in another section. So yeah, so Tamar would be another one, the Genesis Tamar, who could kind of fall into that class.
Okay. See, now I speak up too soon here because I didn't dig into it a super amount, but what I saw in looking at the author's blog and just sort of perusing the titles and the way and the sort of the publisher's descriptions of them, it sort of looked to me like like much of it was how we can learn from the bad girls of the Bible as a negative example, that we can learn not to be like the bad girls of the Bible, or that we can be, I don't know, better behaved, and and in that sense, playing a little bit more into sort of the long trajectory, the long history, wherein certainly figures like Athaliah, who's briefly queen of Judah, Jezebel, an active power player, as queen in the north, have traditionally been seen in a very been seen in a very negative light, and only recently, relatively recently, 40, 50 years or whatever, more and more readers, finding positives in this, seeing Jezebel as a person with a great deal of strength, Jezebel as a person who goes out with dignity, Athaliah as a queen mother who holds things together, while the Davidic line is in jeopardy in the South because of coup d'état, and so on. And so with the when we get into like Rebecca, for example, to return to Genesis 12 to 50, Rebecca, yeah, I mean, as a mother, there's a problem there because, she certainly plays favorites among her kids. She assists she assists the one child in deceiving her husband to the benefit of the other child. It's morally problematic, but she's strong. She's certainly making things happen. She's not simply passive, and it makes me realize that I myself have participated in a reading of the women of Genesis 12 through 50, and the women in the Old Testament generally, I'm more apt to take for granted that being a bad girl is a pretty good thing. That being a bad girl in the Bible is a pretty good thing because they're sticking it. They're literally they are sticking it to the man. And for me, it has become a presupposition that this is a good thing, and these are readings that are going to be sort of generative and liberating, and so on. And so I get caught up short being reminded that there are readers for whom that's not already the case. For whom Rebecca's actions are really going to cause some pause and say, is this a character that I can get behind? Is this somebody that I actually want to call ancestress? In the same way that, I mean, even, certainly that Abraham, that we read Abraham's behavior, passing his wife off as his sister, and so on.
Well, and I agree with you wholeheartedly, because I think about Jacob, who really is one of my favorite Genesis characters, but he's so messed up and so, so manipulative and deceitful and dysfunctional, and his own favoritism within his own family. And there's I was watching a documentary years ago about a group of Hasidic Jews teaching young boys, and it was a classroom of all boys, and the rabbi was saying, you boys must listen and you must study the Torah, and then you will grow up and to be like Jacob. And at the time I thought, oh God, I would not want my son to grow up and be like Jacob in many ways. And so it is interesting how we can kind of gloss over some of the men's behavior, or not you and I personally, but people can gloss over their behavior and hold them up as examples and are more reluctant for the women. But in terms of Rebecca, I find what's so fascinating about her is that sort of, I don't know how you want to say it, either the oracle or prophecy she gets when the twins are struggling in her womb. And she hears from God, directly from God, that the elder will serve the younger. And so if you take that verse into account when you're analyzing her character, like on the one hand, you could see it as she's actually working hard to make God's word come true. And in other situations, I think we could hold that up as, isn't that a good thing? I mean, someone who's willing to go whatever lengths necessary to make sure that God's plan comes true, even to the extent that she tells Jacob, let the curse be on me, my son. I want to make sure this happens. And so again, I think it says a lot about the interpreters as well as the text itself, as so many things do in this way.
You know what? And that I get. Okay, a couple thoughts going on that. So one, it reminds me of a similar reading of the Sarah and Hagar story, in that Sarah is sometimes really beaten up in the history of tradition on the Sarah and Hagar story. The line of interpretation being, oh, Sarah loses faithfulness in God's promise, right? There's this promise that's been made regarding progeny and the progeny in the land and so on, and then things sort of just go on and on, without Abram and Sarai having a child. And when Sarai has Hagar go to Abraham in order to be impregnated by him, some lines of interpretation have historically read that as Sarah losing faith. Oh, she lost faith. And then all this conflict that you have around Isaac and Ishmael, afterwards, and historically as representatives of the people Israel, and I don't know, I guess people would once have said Arabs, but the neighbors of Israel, and especially those described as the progeny of Ishmael. Even today, right, to the Palestine is Israel conflicts. Sarah, all that gets laid at Sarah's door, because she lost faith. But you can flip it, and people do. There are those who flip that line of interpretation and say, no, Sarah, is getting active, getting busy on participating in the fruition, so to speak, of God's promise. That is, Sarah simply does not take it for granted that faith is a passive thing, right? And why would one? That faith, that to be faithful means to sit around and sit on your hands and do nothing and wait for God to make the promises happen. Sarah assumes that she is supposed to be an active participant in the coming to realization of God's word. Rahab in the spies story, being another example, right, where she's, the question of is Rahab a person of faith, because she proclaims, as a Canaanite, oh, we know that your God is the God of heaven and earth, and the God who brought you across the sea in the Exodus. But the text points out that she's not alone in having that kind of faith. All of the Canaanites agree that they're screwed. All of the Canaanites know that the God of Israel is the God of the cosmos who has brought them across but the difference between the rest of the Canaanites and Rahab is Rahab gets busy and acts on it, right? Rahab acts on it by hiding the spies, by getting involved, by getting on the winning side. And so I just keep seeing this repeated theme in this kind of interpretation that takes the acts of these women, that have previously been put in a negative light, right? And putting those actions in a positive light.
Yeah, and that just, what you just said about Rahab made me think, of course, about she's debated in the New Testament, is it her faith or is it her works? And depending which text you're reading, oh, she had this great faith, but then like you're saying, I guess maybe I lean a little bit more toward, but her faith was something that was enacted. And I don't mean to strain this comparison, Brooke, so tell me if you think I'm pushing it too hard, but I wonder if there is some parallel there to what's going on with protests right now, that some people would say, we just got to sit and wait and have faith that God's going to work things out, or have faith that justice is going to be done. And you have other people saying, we've been waiting for a really long time and there hasn't been a change, so we got to do something about it. And so again, I don't want to push that analogy too far, but I wonder if there might be some similarity in that. What do you think about that?
I mean, I think my impulse on that is I mean, I agree, and I think right, what we see, and that I think you and I would both encourage readers and co-readers of the text, readers in community of the text, to be suspicious of, and to be aware of, are these lines of interpretation that present as a kind of a double standard, right? For those who traditionally hold power, like men. Having faith means, moving from Ur to Canaan. It means, and that's something that Abraham is told to do. But like, passing off his sister as his wife, almost anything Abraham chooses to do is going to be commended as an action. If Abraham passes his wife off as his sister, the lines of interpretation are going to tend to find ways for this to be creditable, for this to be good, for this to be something that, and for this to be something that moves the football forward in terms of the fruition of God's promises of land and progeny, and so on. But those who are historically of less power, like in this case, women, their faith is a different faith. Their faith is presupposed to be a passive faith, a faith of waiting, a faith of sitting on one's hands, a faith of listening and not being seen and not heard, of listening and not talking. And I think that is, I think that carries through in our time. When beyond gender, there's race is another axis, right, of greater and lesser power. And I think there is a cultural presupposition. No one needs me even to, or us to even point this out, but right, that in a way, you can kind of, I guess, where I would want to take the screwdriver on that and start prying things up and looking at it is the use of Martin Luther King by whites who sanction the protesters, and who call for peaceful protest, and who call for I see this repeatedly on the call for all blacks, or any black person brought in front of any person of color brought in front of a microphone is supposed to condemn the violence, and with this appeal on the part of the white interviewer to Martin Luther King and peaceful protest, implicitly against, say, the Malcolm X's and others, and then completely overlooking that, like, there's no shortage of that this false dichotomy between Martin Luther King and Malcolm X is itself a creation of a white interest in making the claim that to be a real protester or a good protester, you only have peaceful, nonviolence is the only option available to you. Because, hey, look, MLK, when Dr. King can be quoted also. I'm not going to have the quote. I've seen the quote this week, but in which he describes how he understands the recourse to violence. And so, yeah, this idea of, is faith an active thing or is faith a passive thing, proves to be less and less abstract and more nitty gritty when we look at the way that rhetoric plays out in the media around this week, the protests in Baltimore, right? There's more to be said about that, but I guess that's what I think about right now, about active faith and passive faith.
Yeah, and I've seen that quote too a couple times this week. I think King uses not even the language of violence. He says riots. He can understand that. There's a reason for it.
Riots are the language of the unheard, or the recourse of the unheard, or the something of the unheard is the way that it comes into my memory now.
Yeah, I think that's right. And pushing beyond, well, related to our texts about the women and how they act in Genesis 12 through 50, it also makes me think a little bit about Shiphrah and Puah in Exodus, how they, in a sense, they are doing something deceptive, but they're also they're preserving life, and they're doing something frankly more creative in terms of their protest against the powers of Pharaoh, the structures that happen there. There's something else I wanted to say about, yeah, maybe to go back to Genesis as well. I think Tamar is another, just, I've been doing some work with her recently, and just in Genesis 30 out how uncomfortable she makes people in terms of her sexuality and the way she uses that. And I personally don't think that her veil signals her prostitution. I think Judah thinks she is.
Okay, now back up just a little bit. And the reason I ask you to back up just a little bit is because a number, certainly of my students, have very recently done an assignment on the other Tamar, on Tamar, the brother of Amnon, the daughter of David, who was raped by Amnon. And so just in case there are some folks who have not managed by Thursday afternoon to have become acquainted with the other biblical Tamar, remind us of who she is and what her story is about.
Yeah, thanks for that. And it is interesting that you've got these two Tamars in the Hebrew Bible, and some people suggest that one is almost a midrash on the other, and I kind of like that interpretation, that the second Samuel Tamar is a victim, and it's tragic. She's raped by her half brother, and her father really pays no attention to this. She's left desolate in her brother's house. And in contrast, the Genesis Tamar is this, she's someone who takes charge of her sexuality. She is also abused by the men in not quite as perhaps a direct way as the text makes it happen, but I think you pointed this out to me, Brooke, that she is also abused. So anyway, in Genesis 38, it seems like an interruption to the Joseph narrative. Joseph is Genesis 37 through Genesis 50. And if you're trying to read through Joseph, just be warned that there's going to be this sort of scandalous interruption that a lot of people don't read or don't know what to do with. What happens is it talks about Judah, Joseph's brother, who was seen in Genesis 37 selling his brother into slavery. He was the one who said, let's make some money off our brother. Let's not kill him. Let's get rich off him. And then it talks about his life. So he gets married. He has 3 sons. Er is first, then Onan, and then Shelah. And his eldest son, Er, marries Tamar. And Er, we're not told what he does. We're just told that he's evil and God kills him. The text just isn't at all interested in the things that are like, wait, what? Why did that happen?
He's bad. He had to go. That's that.
Yeah, and even his name is his name is Ayin Resh, and Resh Ayin in Hebrew is evil. So there's some clue in terms of he's just bad.
His name is evil spelled backwards.
Exactly. Yeah. So you play it backwards on a record, and then he dies. So then Tamar gets given in marriage to his younger son, Onan. And we see some of this in the legal codes, which you're going to talk about next week. But there are these laws that if a brother dies, then the wife is to be given to the brother in marriage. Onan, this is where it gets even more scandalous. We're told that Onan is married to Tamar, but when they have sex, he spills his semen on the ground instead of having sex with her all the way. And then this is bad. God sees this as bad, so God kills Onan as well. Onan is dead, and so now Tamar should be given to Shelah as the third son, the only living son left, as a wife, but Judah won't. So Tamar is shipped off to her father's house where she's a widow. She takes matters into her own hands. Judah's wife dies. Tamar hears about it. She goes and she veils herself, and Judah thinks she's a prostitute, and Judah sleeps with her, and then she becomes pregnant. Then I'm leaving a whole lot of details out, but then Judah finds out she's pregnant and says, oh, she played the harlot, burn her, which is actually a very harsh punishment for adultery in that time. That wasn't the typical punishment. Tamar had been wise, and before Judah went on his way, she got his seal and his signet ring. Is that it? I'm forgetting the two. Anyway, she has these identifying markers of Judah, which would be similar to someone's passport today or someone's driver's license. So something that would identify you. And so then she says, this is the father. And Judah says, she's more righteous than I. And Tamar has twins. So she replaces Judah's 2 dead sons with 2 new sons for him. And then Tamar also becomes one of the women mentioned in Matthew 1 is in the line of Jesus. That was a really long intro to Tamar. So. And did you have a specific question about her, Brooke?
Um, how did we come around to Tamar? We were talking about Baltimore. What was it about Tamar?
Maybe I just went back to the fact that women's are in these positions of doing things actively, but maybe not in the sort of traditional or accepted way.
And there's kind of a theme here that comes up a lot when we talk about the actions of women in patriarchal narratives, where biblical or otherwise, right? Because I mean, you can do this throughout literature. The ways in which women act in the ways that are available to them, and they are not the same ways that are available to men. And so often what looks kind of like sneaky, deceptive, conniving kind of behavior is the if you look at how I haven't tried this metaphor before, so let's see what happens. If you look at the warped shape of the social space, the constricted and warped shape of the social space in which women live, their actions, which look like their actions are like all look like corkscrews, are a straight line in the space in which they live. Does that make sense? Sort of like, the Earth goes in an ellipse around the sun, but from a relativity standpoint, it's moving in a straight line on a curved surface, right? It's moving what for the Earth is a straight line around a curved space, like a penny going around the funnel before it drops into the little thing in the museum. And I like that idea of understanding actions like Tamar, who she dresses up, she literally disguises herself in order and tricks Judah in order to accomplish what she is called to accomplish, what she needs to accomplish, what is owed her. And she's the one who disguises herself, and not just disguises herself, but apparently, or as a prostitute, certainly disguises herself in such a way as to make herself sexually available to her father-in-law, and deceives him, and then exposes in front of the community that she has tricked him. And his response is to say that she has been the righteous one. And that's what I see being recognized there, is that within the constricted and warped social space in which she lives and to which Judah has contributed, she has acted in a straight line. She has been, to be righteous, is to be straightforward. She has actually been straightforward, given her circumstances.
Yeah, and you see that like the prophets constantly have that parallelism between righteous and yashar, the straight, so you get that as well. Yeah, that's great. I love that metaphor. I think there's something really interesting about that within the constraints, it is more straightforward than it first might appear, and to recognize the patriarchal constraints of the setting, I think maybe that would be a reason to keep calling them the patriarchal narratives, because they're really patriarchal in that sense.
Because they're so patriarchal.
Yeah.
So someone asked, and this is just right now in Twitter, makes the comment, it's so ingrained in people. It's not really a question, it's a comment. It's so ingrained in people that gender roles are absolute because, quote, God says so, hashtag Mark Driscoll theology. And we get into such a lot of nuance in these biblical studies courses, about hermeneutics and interpretation and so on. I kind of like the way that comment just invites us to sort of step back to this basic question that folks will often, or a presupposition that folks will have, is that if the Bible presents things in a certain way, then that's the way that things are supposed to be. And if there are things that the Bible assumes are good, then we are supposed to assume that those things are good. Both Old Testament and New Testament, right? If these gender roles in this case are presupposed, and then you start just looking for counter, then the counter narratives start adding up. So, for example, slavery, right? A certain amount of ink and sweat goes into making the claim that the Bible does not approve of slavery. And you can do that in a kind of theological way that says, oh, the Bible as a whole tends towards justice. It tends towards the leveling of social hierarchies, and so on. And yeah, yes, if you are good, you can do that thing. That said, biblical texts presuppose slavery. They presuppose the goodness of slavery, and there aren't any biblical texts that say slavery is bad. I mean, I'm not aware of any biblical texts, certainly nothing of any substance or clarity, that says slavery is bad. That says, hey, all that stuff that we said before about slavery being good, forget about it. Slavery's not good. Like, that doesn't happen in the biblical text. And I guess that's the kind of that sometimes, do you find you have, Sarah, these kinds of examples? Like, that's one of my go-tos. Like, whenever anything falls in the area of, well, it's this way in the Bible, so therefore that's the way it's supposed to be. Slavery is like my go-to on that. With sexuality, for example, when people talk about, well, there's these, when people are debating about whether the handful of clobber texts around sexuality, what they mean and what they don't mean and so on, I have my own kind of table clearer, way of clearing the table on that is divorce, right? Because something the Bible is very clear on in both the Testaments is divorce. We're not supposed to divorce. And yet that's an example where certainly the mainline Protestant churches absolutely have said, yeah, we hear the Bible seriously on divorce. We're going to go another way on this one. And we've got some reasons, and we can talk about those. Certainly whatever you think is going on with the sexual, and maybe next week, if we do a hangout, it'd be a good time to ask, to bring up the law codes, Leviticus 18, and so on around sexuality. But do you find that you've got, I guess it's kind of a loosey-goosey question. I'm not quite sure what I'm asking you, Sarah, but these kinds of like go-tos.
Yeah, and I think one of mine, I do go to slavery, because you're exactly right that it's presupposed in the text. And I think the way that John Levinson talks about it, I think is really helpful to say. It actually gets a little embarrassing when you read and see how often there is slavery presupposed in it, especially when you read Exodus is God freeing the people from slavery. Yeah, that's another topic. But to me, I tend to go to marriage also as, the biblical view of marriage. Well, it was polygamous, and especially these texts today, the Genesis patriarchal narratives where, yeah, not at all a problem that not only does Abraham have 2 wives, he also has 2 concubines, Jacob has 2 wives and 2 concubines, and David has all these wives that he has, and that's not really a problem. It becomes a problem for Solomon because they turn his heart away, but it's not the number of wives. So that's one that I like to sort of pull out. That tends to be more Old Testament than a New Testament, so it falls a little bit more flat than slavery or divorce, for example. But your comment, or the student's comment about gender, I find so interesting. I've got to give a shout out to my colleague, Jennifer McKinney. She's a sociology professor here at Seattle Pacific University. She just did a lecture. It's a public lecture. You could find it on SPU's website for those of you who are interested, on gender theologies from a sociological perspective. And she was looking at church sect theory throughout American history. And she said that one of the ways that a sect is differentiated from a church is its tension to the larger culture. And one of the really successful ways to be in tension to the larger culture is how you view gender, because gender is one of these things that shifts and changes over time sociologically. And she ended with some examples from the former Mars Hill Church, which is in Seattle, and some of the things that Mark Driscoll said about gender theology. So it's a fascinating look at how gender has been used in the church, because the Bible says so, and people then say so.
And this is just a tangential thing, but just because you reminded me of it, we were talking about Tamar, and the second Samuel Tamar, the daughter of David Tamar, and you've written about this. I know you've written about it, and we've talked about it. But the garment that she rips isn't that a garment of long sleeves or whatever, which is the same kind of garment that Joseph is wearing at the beginning of the Joseph story when his brothers are presumably out all like working and getting dirty and being men, and Joseph is at home wearing what's traditionally been read as a coat of many colors, right? Probably more likely a coat of long sleeves. You can't wear a coat of long sleeves when you're out doing manly man work, right? And when you see that Tamar, for example, a princess, is also wearing this garment of long sleeves, that's one way in which gender is brought forward in the Joseph story, in some way or another, right? In some way or another, Joseph is perhaps being contrasted with his brothers as being relatively effeminate and pampered. He's sort of a pampered pet around the household and effeminate in these ways. I haven't read. I don't even remember if Nisha's dissertation wound up being on this, and that's my bad. I should remember better and know better. But I remember Nisha was writing on gender bending in Genesis 38, around the story of Joseph and Potiphar's wife. But I'm not going anywhere in particular with that. As an entree to since we've already been going at questions about gender in terms of the men and the women of Genesis, and the patriarchs and the matriarchs in Genesis, and their respective avenues and their respective roles, and the different ways that they're interpreted for their actions or their inactions. And then here's another now, and then Joseph is at least one area, and not the only one, where there's the beginning of being able to look at non-binary, at gender as a non-binary in in Genesis 12 through 50.
Yeah, that's great. And to say it's not only so he's wearing the ketonet pasim, which is the exact same garment that Tamar in 2 Samuel 12 wears. And it's the only two places that you see in the entire Hebrew Bible that this particular garment gets mentioned. And in 2 Samuel 12, it's described as the garment worn by the virgin daughters of the king. So yes, it is this sort of, princessy outfit, but also maybe even more with sexuality in terms of virginity there. And yeah, and what Tamar does in 2 Samuel 12 is she tears this garment after she's been raped by her brothers. So, which I argue is not just a sign of grief. Typically people say you tear your clothes when you're grieving, but I say it's more symbolic that her status as being a virgin has been ripped, and so she's got some power of her clothes. She doesn't have a lot of power in the narrative, so she does that. But to return to the other thing about gender that may get us into some of the covenant questions is I find it fascinating that that Jacob, who gets the covenant, he's the line that the Abrahamic covenant continues with. He's described as, in contrast to his brother Esau. I mean, Esau's a manly man. He's all hairy, and he's shooting arrows and going hunting. And Joseph, I think it's interesting how the text tend to translate it as Tom, as quiet, but it's definitely
Jacob, you mean, right?
Yeah, sorry, Jacob is. Yeah, in contrast to his brother Esau, twin brother Esau, who's out fighting and hunting and gathering, he's in the tents and he's cooking food, and he's described in this way that is very different. And so is there some kind of gender essentialism that the text is playing with that Jacob doesn't quite fit the manly man perspective?
Yeah, and in both these cases, there's that. It's interesting because there's a standard trope that we all talk about when we're doing these texts in an introductory class, especially, where over this what would you call it? Not an overturning perhaps, but certainly a subversion of patrilinear descent, whereby the oldest son is the heir to the father, and over again we have these younger sons, sometimes the youngest sons. David is an example, right? Jacob as a younger son is an example. Joseph as a younger but not youngest son, one of the last two, right? Him and Benjamin, if I remember rightly, but who surpass their brother. Solomon, right, is another one, right, with a huge body count there, and we all talk about that, but now you're calling attention, Sarah, to the ways in which, like taking Joseph as an example and now taking Jacob as an example and making me want to look for other examples, David, perhaps, where they're not simply in a rote way said, oh, this is the younger one, as if that's all we need to know in order to enjoy this subversion of patrilinear descent, but they have to be described as less manly than their brothers. It's not just that they're younger, but they're more effeminate, arguably less manly in the ways that the reader will expect, more pampered, and so on, so as to really set up that subversion, right? So as to really set up that subversion of patrilinear descent when, against all odds, God has chosen this one, to be the one who in the ancestral stories, the one who carries the promise forward to the next generation, and in the monarchical, or become king, in the stories of Samuel and Kings.
Yeah, and I wonder how Isaac would fit into that with Ishmael too, because he's clearly the younger, but we don't have as much information on the sort of manliness, those sort of traditionally associated things with him. But I think
Ishmael is a wild man.
He is, yeah, and so he's got that. I mean, Ishmael's more complicated because he's got a different mother, Hagar. Although I suppose you still have that. You've got the different mothers with Joseph, as opposed to the oldest son Reuben, and David's children certainly have different mothers. So maybe that's neither here nor there. But I think that it is interesting that Hagar is the foreigner, and so she's not the one that the child of promise comes from. And then I think that also may circle back to your original comment about covenant, and why is it that the covenant goes to Isaac and not to Ishmael, and what does that say about God God's preference for these people? I find Joel Kaminsky helpful on this when he talked about how there's the elect, those with whom God makes the covenant, and then you have your clear anti-elect, like the Amalekites who just get wiped out. But then Kaminsky adds a third category, the non-elect. And so trying to say that it's not just that God's election means God's rejection of other, but there may be this other category that is sort of, they're not cursed, if you want to use those, again, binary terms, but they're just not the recipients of the election or the covenant. And he argues that Ishmael falls into that, because Ishmael does get blessing, but it's just not the covenant going with him. So have you read that book, or what do you think about those terms in terms of, sorry, cut off, in terms of how covenant plays out? Like, does covenant automatically imply non-covenant with others, or election and rejection?
I mean, you're right. I mean, it's super. I think it's super interesting the way that covenant is understood. We're talking about like the chosen people, right? That covenant is a covenant in the sense of a chosen people is understood in the Hebrew Bible versus the way it's maybe more commonly understood. A lot of people have seen, really a great example of this is, Fiddler on the Roof, which a lot of people have seen, where Tevye Tevye's got so many great lines in there. I mean, it's just, he's just such a hysterical character. And, he is himself a Jewish patriarch in this village, right? With these, I think 4 daughters. And of course, where the whole, very early on, you don't even have to have seen the play before to know that this is moving towards pogrom, that this is moving towards local, regional, anti-Semitic, Russian, pogrom that's going to be moving, that's going to be displacing this family. And so there's that kind of, through all the really funny parts of Fiddler on the Roof, there is this, low rumble of thunder in the background. And so when Tevius says in one of his soliloquies, talking to God, and he says, "Oh God," paraphrasing, "Oh God, I know we are your chosen people, but once in a while, couldn't you choose somebody else?" And that just perfectly gets to that issue of, like, chosen for what? Like, for what are the people chosen? Well, it's complicated. I mean, on the one hand, and speaking of low rumbles of thunder running through the text, we know that through these ancestral stories, as this promise of land and progeny gets moved forward from one generation to the next, we know that one of the places this is going is genocide, right? In terms of the final form of this overarching biblical narrative that we see in the Pentateuch and in the Deuteronomistic history, this is moving towards the displacement of the Canaanites, who are on this land that has been set apart for the descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and only for them. And so chosen people can look like a really good deal, at least for the chosen people, in that respect, and like a really bad deal, like implicitly or by consequence, a really bad deal for those who aren't chosen. On the other hand, there's this understanding that to be chosen is to have been given the gift of the law, right? And that the chosen people are the ones who receive the gift of the law on Sinai. And we talk a lot in biblical studies these days about how that Christian Protestant interpreters have tended to see the law through Luther's, through very Luther, and not Lutheran, but I guess Luther and Luther-like eyes, as this burden, right? Almost this sort of like being hag-ridden, like there's this, sort of monster on your shoulders riding you around, in the way that Luther sort of, understood law in his day. And that being put on Paul, which it probably doesn't really belong there, because it's not really how Paul seems to actually talk about things. So we talk all the time about how that the Hebrew Bible and the Judaism, certainly of up into Jesus's time, as far as we can read them, understand the law to be a gift, right? We find ourselves often calling attention to this, that the law is a gift. The law is a gift. At the same time, it's a gift, but it's still the law. Right, and this is going to show how little everyone always thinks that Old Testament scholars know all about Judaism, and the fact is that we don't, right? Because what we know about is the Hebrew Bible, which sits before, not only before, it sits before Judaism as much as it sits before Christianity, right? It's more like a fork in the road, So we're not experts on Judaism, which I will show when I talk in very sort of casual and loose and sweeping terms about Judaisms, as far as we can read them in Jesus, up to Jesus' time, and even into the rabbinic period, as to how do you have a place in the world to come, right? And for a Jew to have a place in the world to come, you obey the law. And that doesn't mean you have to always flawlessly follow each of the, without breaking them, all of the 613 or whatever, laws of the Hebrew Bible, because part of the law is these mechanisms, just as in the way that Christianities understand themselves, of sin, repentance, and forgiveness, sin, repentance, and forgiveness. And so include, to hold it right back to covenant, so that one holds one's place in the covenant, right? You're not falling out of the covenant all the time. These cycles take place within the safety of the bounds of covenant. But what do you have to do if you're a Gentile? Well, if you're a Gentile, you basically have to not eat blood and not kill people, and that's how a Gentile has a place in the world to come. So, when you talk about being the chosen people, that's an example where being the chosen people is a pretty tough row to hoe. whereas being unchosen is not so, is, in that sense, not so bad. But the Gentiles have to live without the gift of the law, right? The gift of that particular relationship, maybe not even a better one, but a particular relationship with God, that comes with the gift of the law. And then, of course, you can get then into things around like Second Isaiah, and trying to understand what does it mean in Babylonian exile after the destruction of Jerusalem to be the chosen people. What does it mean to be the chosen people whom God has chosen to bring the nations against and, almost complete, and to all appearances completely destroy. And second Isaiah 40 to 55's answer to that, right, is that to be the chosen people in this circumstance means to be a light to the nations. Because when God, against all expectations, raises the people Israel up, restores them in Jerusalem, and exalts them to greater heights than ever before, all the Gentiles will look and say, "Holy smokes! Holy Moses! The God of this people Israel, that we had all but destroyed, turns out to be the God of the cosmos," and they will learn something about the God of Israel that they had never anticipated before. So there's so much to this question of what does it mean to be chosen people, and it's all getting started now. It's all getting started now in Genesis 12 through 50, and I think in some way, I think all the strands are there. Like when there's that line, I think it's in Genesis 12, all the nations of the world will bless themselves in you. And our own instructor, right, J.J.M. Roberts, and others will hasten to point out that in its origins, it's likely, it's at least arguable that phrase, all the nations of the world will bless themselves in you, it could mean something as mundane as you will be so successful in terms of land and progeny with this blessing I'm giving you, that all the people of the world will say, "Oh, dear God, please make me as successful as Abraham." That is, all the people will invoke blessing upon themselves using your name. But I think even at the point of this story's inclusion in an Abraham cycle, I kind of want to suspect that it's already being understood in a way that is pointing towards things like second Isaiah's light to the nations and so on. Does that make sense?
It totally does. And that's the thing I wanted to respond to most when you started talking about covenant and chosenness here. And the fact that as part of this, land and descendants that is promised to Abram and then to the people of Abraham through Isaac, the Israelites, eventually, this chosen people. But it also includes this blessing. And part of the blessing is for them, you will be blessed. But then it's also, you are to be a blessing in some way. And so the election isn't just about what you get, it's also what you need to do for others. And I think that's an important piece that has tended to get ignored or looked over in the covenant. But what you're saying, Brooke, it feels like you're teeing up really nicely for next week to talk about how these covenants, the Abrahamic covenant that get made here through this particular people, this particular group, how do they relate to the covenant of the law, the Sinaitic covenant, which will be your topic next week, right?
Yeah, I think next week, I think we can do two things next week. And my TA lets me know that there's at least 6 folks who are on deck, who have in their plans another hangout for what they're doing in this course. So I think we'll go ahead with next week. And something that I was just sort of thinking about in the back of my head while we've been talking today, Sarah, is one, the topic for next week is law, and that gets us very naturally into questions around law and grace, God of the Old Testament versus the God of the New Testament, and so on and so on. We've already addressed that stuff in some of our hangouts, and so we would sort of be painting over that again. And I think what that leaves scope for is maybe it would be fun on the last one, and especially as we, what it's like at the end of the semester. You almost just want to play hangman at the board all the time, and call it learning. And I'm sympathetic to where people are. I wonder if we might do sort of like a stump the professors kind of week. And maybe this would be a good week to really, and I can be communicating to this to students ahead of time. This would be a good, you know, we try to answer questions as we go. I'm always usually sort of putting one eye on Twitter, and one ear listening to my guests. So we don't always get to all the questions. So maybe next week would be a good one to just encourage students to go nuts and just ask anything. Learners ask anything, and we'll just sort of maybe like in a almost after the manner of a bonus round where we're just racing through answers, or in the way that we like to do, because we're really good higher education instructors, answering questions with questions, you know, so we can decide what kind of questions we want to respond to those questions with. So maybe that would be something for us to do next week as well. I think that kind of sounds like fun.
And you're killing me because I can't be here next week, but maybe there'd be a way to have people, you know, other people want to write in something. But the questions with questions, do you mean that we couldn't say, what do you think? As an answer?
That would be an hour of, or just, you know, answering the, you know, saying the question back to them, you know?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, maybe you need to have some ground rules, like these sorts of answers are off the table for the
That's right. That's right.
Students.
I know we're out of time. One question that did go unanswered this time, and I guess I don't think we can really address it even, but I'd like to honor it, is the question of the historicity of the patriarchal narratives, right? Because a lot has happened, even during our sort of academic lifetime. You know, you and me, Sarah, and certainly that of our own instructors. It was not that long ago where a lot of stuff was found. John Bright would really be the whose history you would look at for this, where so much really good, super useful, interesting information was just coming up out of the ground in archaeological expeditions and so on, and the reading that were showing us a lot about the early second millennium BCE, the early and mid second millennium BCE in the Levant, that just sort of raised lots of suggestions that said, hey, kind of reminds me of the ancestral stories, kind of reminds me of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And then even people like it turns out the name Jacob was a thing, you know, in this time and place, which you know is of course going to be super interesting. And there was a lot of confidence for a while in the basic historicity of the ancestral narratives, and we've really come a long way from that since that time. Things have really kind of done a U-turn to where less and less and less and less confidence, more and more noticing that, well, you know, yeah, there were nomads in those days. Are Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob really nomads? Like, we know a lot about what nomadic life is and was. Do they really act like that in the narratives, or do they just migrate? Do they move? Is everybody who moves house a nomad? Maybe not, you know. Some of my students are writing sagas this week, and one of the things I wanted to point out to them about the genre of saga is that there's not really a thick background to a saga, right? You know, you've got Abraham and Sarah interacting with Abimelech or with Pharaoh and everything, and it's sort of like they're against a white sheet of paper. There's like nobody behind them doing anything. There's no people with jobs and stuff, as opposed to the book of Judges, where when you read the narratives of the book of Judges, there's a lot of thick background. There's a lot of people, so to speak, walking around in the background doing jobs and living lives, where there's just sort of that verisimilitude to life that you don't have in the patriarchal narratives. Again, reinforcing this idea that these really may be things that are, at least certainly in their current form, written pretty late. And in some ways pretty transparently to set the stage for, say, the Exodus narrative, to set the stage for things that are going to be happening later in the Pentateuch. Do I do anything like justice to sort of the long arc that we're
I think you do, and you were always more interested in history than I was back in our seminar days. And so I don't think I'm going to answer the question directly, the student's question, but I find it interesting how history and story have become so intertwined. And I'm thinking about something like the novel, The Red Tent, that was just made into a mini series. So this is a novel based on the women in Jacob's life, specifically his daughter Dinah. She's the one who she gets raped by Shechem in Genesis 34. And there's this novel about her that just came out over Christmas time as a Lifetime miniseries. And so it's a story, but what I find fascinating about it that I think relates to the question of history is how you produce this into a film, and how do you costume the people, and how do you have them show their lives in such a way that makes it look more historical. And even though this was produced by, I think it was Lifetime, it sort of had a little bit of that History Channel feel to try and say, this is what they looked like, this is the way that they lived, so look and see how this story could have taken place. So again, that overlap between history and story. But I think maybe underneath it, there is this impulse to say, what is the history? How did they live? How can we imagine that? And even if it's not historically true, how can we see it?
And that's, I mean, just sort of, to close out on a note relating to events of the week, and then the work that some of my students were doing previously on Ferguson syllabus and relating to Freddie Gray in Baltimore this week. I've been really encouraged by the way that a number of folks talking about how an Introduction to Old Testament course could better integrate its subject matter with questions around current issues like around hashtag Black Lives Matter, police and other state-controlled violence against Black bodies, and something that came up again and again there. A number of great things came up, but history as itself an ideologically laden cultural artifact. That there are no disinterested narrators. That even when you get, there's a lot of things you can ask about in what way, how was history understood or not understood in the ancient world? What was history trying or not trying to accomplish? But even up to the current day, it's that no matter how rigorously you are trying to do, full, according to Hoyle, peer-reviewed, objective history, that you have to do that in the knowledge that you yourself will be identified later as having created another ideologically laden cultural artifact, that the narrator you produce in your history is no more disinterested than those in the past. And so with the narratives that we're beginning to construct, that we're constructing now, right? So with the narratives that we're constructing now. Okay, we're way past time. Sorry, I don't mean to keep it this long, Sarah, and also the people that are following. So, folks, thank you so much. This has been a Google Hangout on Air for OOTLE15, the Open Old Testament Learning Event 2015. You should be able to see the course at OOTLE15.net. And I'm Brooke Lester at Garrett Evangelical Theological Seminary. Oh, sorry, this has been Sarah. Go ahead.
And sorry, I'm technical problems there. And I'm Sarah Koenig at Seattle Pacific University.
Thanks so much, Sarah, and thanks everyone for joining us. And yeah, join us, I think, for law and grace, law and gospel, etc., and stumping the professors, I think, next week for our last Google Hangout. Thanks again.